Winter Palace, St. Petersburg, May 6th, 1917. The hammers of the typewriter crash down on the page. Extraordinary Commission of Inquiry for the investigation of illegal acts by ministers and other responsible persons of the Tsarist regime. Anna, once a maid of honor to the Empress of Russia, nervously wrings her hands. She sits in the throne room, but there's no longer a throne in it. The wallpaper has been torn down, just like the Tsar. Anna, you see, has been brought here from prison. Across from her, the interrogator smokes, and when the typist is ready, he begins to ask questions. He wants to know about the Tsar and Tsarina, their contacts with occultists and mesmerists, but especially about one man. How, he wants to know, did the imperial family meet Rasputin?
This Extra History Complete is brought to you by you, our wonderful backers over for the calendar on Kickstarter, our YouTube channel members, every bean who's ever bought anything from our merch store, and our phenomenal patrons over on Patreon. You are all what make this show possible, and I cannot thank you enough, but I'll do it one more time. Thank you.
If there's one character from Russian history everybody knows, it's Grigori Rasputin. Arguably more famous than the Tsar and Tsarina he served, his reputation for occult powers and debauchery has transcended the historical reality of his life, transforming him into everything from a horror movie villain, to a comic book character, to a beer mascot, to the subject matter of that amazing Boney M song we riffed with as our April Fool's episode last year. I mean, let's not kid ourselves, that song slaps. After all, who can resist the story of a mad monk who brought down a dynasty? But did he? See, Rasputin became involved with the Tsar at a pivotal moment in Russian history. Just as Nicholas II lost his aristocratic powers, and the monarchy entered a tailspin into war and revolution. And Rasputin became seen in political circles and the press as either the cause of the royals' detachment and decline, or a symptom. Death, too, only enhanced his legend, because once the Tsar abdicated and the country barreled towards revolution, the dead Rasputin served as a convenient way for monarchists and royal advisors to shift blame for the Tsar's poor decisions away from themselves. Even our understanding of Rasputin's assassination comes from the, let's just say, dubious accounts of his killers. In other words, Rasputin is surrounded by a cloud of myth. But like many tales from history, the true story is far more incredible. The man who would walk in imperial palaces and serve an emperor was born in January 1869 in the Siberian village of Pokrovska. And we know about as much of Rasputin's childhood as we do about most Siberian peasants from the time. Which is to say, almost nothing. His family was illiterate, and Grigori would remain so until his 20s. And though political enemies would later claim that he was a horse thief, local records from the time indicate his wild youth never rose above public drunkenness, petty theft, and insubordination toward local officials. At 18, he married a peasant woman, and a decade later, things hadn't really changed much. He was 28, illiterate, living with his father, only now he had 3 children. But all in all, a completely ordinary background. Then, one day, he just kind of left. Now later he would claim to have seen a religious vision, an icon of the Virgin Mary weeping, but it also may have been a more mundane cause, like a crisis of faith or simply an urge to travel. Whatever the reason, in 1897, he set off to walk to a monastery of St. Nicholas, where he claimed to have studied under the local starets, a term for a spiritual elder who attained holiness through spare living and deep meditation. Presumably, this was where Rasputin learned to read, though he declined to stay in the monastery. Monastic life would have meant giving others authority over him, and Rasputin was always wary of that. So instead, he took to the road as a wandering pilgrim, which was a surprisingly popular life choice for men in 19th century Russia. Those seeking spiritual enlightenment, or even just travel and excitement, would simply walk across country to whatever place of pilgrimage they set as a goal. People of all classes did it, traveling in groups and occasionally practicing self-mortification by wearing shackles or engaging in other forms of discomfort. Now personally, Rasputin found shackles distracting. Instead, he tried wearing the same shirt for a year at a time without removing it, walking to shrines and monasteries through heat and cold, dodging brigands, and meeting fellow pilgrims. Stinky, but far more comfy. He did this on and off for years, even claiming to have walked to Mount Athos in Greece, which, if he started at home, would be roughly like walking from New York to Los Angeles. Whew, my dogs are barking just thinking about that. And it was on one of these journeys that he began to feel a bit of his own power. Back on the home front, however, his family felt that the Grigori who had left for the monastery of St. Nicholas was not the one who came back. Now he prayed with an ecstatic fervor that was entrancing to watch, and moved with a new confidence even among the upper class. He stared directly at people with an intensity that they never forgot, and seemed to have an ability to read someone at first meeting, understanding what they wanted, how best to talk to them, or their secret sins. Within a few years, he was leading a prayer group in Pokrovska, which met in a friend's fruit cellar. There, Rasputin's followers, mostly his family and a few locals, sang hymns of his own creation and spoke about God. But not everyone was happy with Rasputin. A local priest tried to warn others away from the pilgrim, who after all was not a priest, by the way, and some said that female followers were washing his body before worship. Plus, there were rumors that he had become linked with the Klaisti, a much older sect known for flagellation and accused of sexual rites that the Orthodox Church deemed heretical. But nonetheless, his fame grew, and people started coming to see him. By 1904, he was taking trips to a nearby city where he was welcomed as a starets himself, known for acting as a spiritual advisor for any who came to him. And he was rumored to be able to heal people with prayer, part of a long-standing tradition in Russia of holy men able to perform miracles. While there, he began meeting figures in the Orthodox Church who were so impressed with his saintliness that they sent him to St. Petersburg with a letter of introduction. Now, what exactly Rasputin was supposed to do in the capital is still up for debate. He claimed to be raising money for a church, though he dropped that idea pretty quickly once he arrived. And instead, he went to parties. See, when he arrived in St. Petersburg, he quickly fell in with an archbishop named Theophan, who had a tendency to collect firebrand right-wing preachers around him. He liked to bring these men into aristocratic salons to nudge the political and religious conversation. There was the ultra-nationalist Bishop Hermogenes, for example, who'd reportedly castrated himself in his 30s and kicked a young Joseph Stalin out of seminary. Also, there was the monk Ilyador, who advocated for deporting all foreigners and wrote deranged pamphlets about how international cabals of Jews and Freemasons were trying to topple the Tsar. It was this incredibly normal and rational circle that Rasputin ended up joining, and they became some of his earliest supporters. Though in truth, he would quickly outshine them all. Because the bored aristocrats of St. Petersburg saw something in Rasputin. His sincerity and religious ecstasy was raw, vital, and exciting. His gray-green eyes bore into you when you met him, and he seemed to just know what you were thinking, you know? And despite his peasant upbringing, he never appeared intimidated by titles or wealth. In fact, his appearance and rough manners added to his mystique, at a time when few aristocrats had seen a Siberian peasant, much less spoken to one. Rasputin appeared exotic and a little threatening, part of the real Russia the Europeanized upper class had lost touch with. When he spoke about faith, it felt grounded and alive. And the way he talked to these aristocrats, touched and stroked their hands, particularly ladies' hands, well, people found it simultaneously provoking, repellent, and magnetic. But just to be clear, Rasputin was certainly not the only mystic running in high circles at the time. In fact, the Russian aristocracy was awash in occultists, mesmerists, spirit mediums, and supposed prophets. These figures increasingly appealed to Russia's upper class, who had become disengaged from Orthodox Christianity and began experimenting with new religious ideas. This ran the gamut from a young Prince Yusupov, who we'll return to later in this story, believing he'd acquired clairvoyant powers, to the composer Alexander Scriabin using occult themes in his music, believing if they were played correctly, it could end the world. So yeah, Rasputin slid nicely into this environment, and as his reputation as a prophet and healer increased, some of his aristocratic contacts decided to introduce him to a new couple who had a great interest in miracle workers, Nicholas and Alexandra, the Emperor and Empress of Russia. They had been without a mystical advisor for some years now, ever since government ministers had forced them to send their last favorite, a French miracle worker, into exile. And Theophan, as well as the occult circles of St. Petersburg, thought they'd found the perfect replacement. So Rasputin, the Siberian peasant, entered the royal circle. Fall, 1907, Peterhof Palace, St. Petersburg. Tsarevich Alexei, heir to the throne of Russia, lies contorted in pain. His leg has swollen to alarming levels. Black patches are under his eyes. He'd been playing in the park when he'd fallen, opening an internal hemorrhage in his leg. And while a nanny follows the young Tsarevich day and night to try and prevent him from injuring himself, the boy is 3 and doesn't always listen. This is the most closely guarded secret in Russia. The heir to the throne has hemophilia. When they cut his umbilical cord, it bled for 2 days. A bruise or cut that would be a comparatively minor injury for another child could kill him. His mother is distraught. Doctors can only give him aspirin, and he begs his mom to make the pain go away. So Alexandra sends a telegram. Find Rasputin. If Rasputin had never come in contact with Nicholas and Alexandra, he would have remained a footnote in Russian history, an obscure figure known mostly to scholars of the late Romanov era. But in 1905, they had their first meeting with the Holy Man, as Nicholas called Rasputin in his diary. Soon, Rasputin was sending them letters full of encouragement and spiritual advice, and they kept meeting irregularly. Now, to understand why the royal couple liked Rasputin, you first need to understand the unique pressures that they were under. Pressures that were partially due to historical trends and circumstance, and partially of their own making. Nicholas and Alexandra were a rare thing in European royalty, a genuine love match. But they still had to overcome opposition from both families to get married. And for good reason, because oh boy, check out these red flags. Alexandra's grandmother, Queen Victoria, thought Russia was unstable. In 1881, revolutionaries had assassinated Nicholas's grandfather in a bomb attack, and she worried her granddaughter would be killed. After all, while Victoria liked Nicholas, he was an inflexible autocrat, meaning more conflict on the horizon. Nicholas's parents, by contrast, disliked Alexandra because she was German, as anti-German sentiment was high in Russia and only got worse as the country approached World War I. Plus, there were doubts of Alexandra's fitness, since she had such severe social anxiety that she was known for freezing during piano recitals and not talking at parties. Relatable? Sure, but probably not the qualities you look for in an empress. And when they married, all those forces came together. Alexandra was intensely private, and at a time she needed to be making allies, she let few people get close to the imperial family. Her stiffness at social events and awkwardness in public was misinterpreted as arrogance or disdain, meaning her absence from the social scene and apparent secretiveness opened the door for society gossips to pass off any rumor as genuine, such as that Alexandra was having a lesbian affair with her favorite maid of honor. And as these society rumors reached the couple, it fueled their us versus them mentality, made Alexandra even more private, and created a situation where they thought every rumor about their inner circle were also just vicious lies. Remember that tidbit later. Things only got worse when Alexandra had 4 girls in a row. Healthy, wonderful kids, but none who could inherit the throne. In their desperation, the couple ended up turning to a French miracle worker, who claimed Alexandra was pregnant with a boy. And they had so much confidence in this man, they even made an official announcement. Then months later, they found out Alexandra wasn't pregnant at all. And under pressure from advisors, Nicholas expelled the healer from Russia and issued an announcement of miscarriage. Then came Alexei in 1904 and his hemophilia. The next year, Russia lost a war to Japan, precipitating a revolution where Nicholas had to cede some of his autocratic power. This included a federal assembly and greater freedom of speech rights, meaning now newspapers could air their own criticisms of the imperial family. So by the time Rasputin arrives, what we have is an isolated, deeply religious family set upon by every imaginable kind of pressure, from political to social to medical to celebrity, plus the very real fear of assassination. And their greatest hope for the future is an uncontrollable toddler who can die if he skins his knee. In other words, when Rasputin started meeting with the couple, he gave them something they truly needed: hope. He told Nicholas that God supported him holding on to power. His magnetic but calming manner, and his assurances God would protect the family, also soothed Alexandra. And he spoke to them about the importance of love. Love of God, the family's love for each other, and the love of one's fellow Christians. But it got a level deeper in 1907, when Alexei fell and Alexandra called for Rasputin to come heal her boy. Rasputin arrived, prayed over the child's bed, and made the sign of the cross over him. Then he told little Alexei that his pain would go away, that God would heal him, and that he should get some sleep. Then he left, and Alexei got better. He fell asleep, and the hemorrhaging stopped. And by the next morning, he was sitting up, free from fever, and recovering. Now, how did that work, you might be asking? Well, historians have debated exactly why, short of divine intervention, that this would be the case. One theory is that Rasputin often threw out the doctors, who were giving Alexei blood-thinning aspirin as treatment. Another is that, perhaps purposely, Rasputin tended to show up just as bleeding episodes were ending, while still others say that Rasputin's presence simply calmed Alexandra, whose anxious behavior often scared Alexei, which led to increased blood pressure and further bleeding. Even Nicholas himself noticed how Rasputin helped Alexandra's anxiety. Once when the Prime Minister complained about Rasputin visiting the family, Nicholas reportedly said, "Better 10 Rasputins than one of the Empress's hysterical fits." Rasputin increasingly visited the Romanovs in their private apartments, even being allowed to play with the children, pray with them at bedtime, and speak alone with Alexandra in her room. Now, this was extremely unusual for someone not in the family, particularly being around the girls in their nightdresses. But the Tsar and Tsarina were not alarmed, and other servants were present. The children treated him sort of like a kind and fun uncle. Meanwhile, Rasputin was using his new legitimacy to move up in the world. He went back to Pokrovska with money, buying a bigger house, and showing the villagers a shirt Alexandra had sewn for him. He also started bringing his followers around, almost all women of both aristocratic and non-aristocratic status. He would give tours of the village, promoting the spirituality of the peasant lifestyle, have his followers stay at his house, and bathe with them at mixed-gender bathhouses, which was scandalous in high society, but common among peasants at the time. And that's when the investigation started. The priests of Pokrovska accused Rasputin of heresy, and both the Orthodox Church and Tsarist secret police began looking into Rasputin's connections to the Klistis and rumors he was sleeping with followers. Aristocratic gossip circulated that Rasputin was bathing with the children at night, sleeping with Alexandra, and had impregnated Olga, the eldest Romanov child. Now, to anyone in the inner circle, these stories were patently and obviously false. But they also primed the royal family to dismiss more credible accusations, like that Rasputin had raped one of his female followers. Then the scandals reached another level, as Russia's newly emboldened press got wind of them. The stories of Rasputin became front-page news, even as former promoters turned on him. Theophan said the holy man had been corrupted by high society, and Hermogen had a revelation in prayer that Rasputin was a demon. In fact, of his church allies, only Iliador stuck by him. Though that wasn't really saying much, since by this point Iliador was way off the deep end. He'd begun claiming major government ministers were secretly Jewish Freemason socialists, started printing images of Jesus, but with Iliador's face, and barricaded himself in his monastery in a months-long police standoff. But Nicholas and Alexandra didn't budge. Even when the Minister of Internal Affairs came to the Tsar and shared the results of his investigation, claiming Rasputin was in fact a Klist, the Tsar simply said that their contacts with Rasputin were a private matter, not one for the state. Things were getting hot though, and this would have been the perfect moment for the Tsar to kick Rasputin to the curb and minimize impact on his family and the monarchy. Instead, they just told him to go away for a little while, and sent him on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, not just helping him escape the limelight, but also to burnish his reputation as a devout man. It didn't work, because the Rasputin that now existed in the public imagination was neither the kind healer the Romanovs knew, or even the abusive manipulator some of his burned followers saw him to be. The public, you see, saw nothing but a sorcerer, a demon, an agent of the devil trying to make the royal family his puppets. And the demon Rasputin, they said, had to die. December 16th, 1911, St. Petersburg. Rasputin came to the island at Hermogenes' invitation. He expected to pray and perhaps eat dinner. Not this. Hermogenes, holding an icon, implores Rasputin to repent his wickedness. Then Iliador hits him with a large cross. Rasputin declares that he is a sinner, guilty of lust. He admits he visited sex workers and slept with his followers. They call him a false prophet and make him swear to never go near the royal family again. And according to one account, he agreed. But if he did, it was another sin, because it was a lie. When Hermogenes confronted Rasputin in December of 1911, it signaled a major turning point in his reputation. We don't know exactly what happened, and many accounts of these events disagree. In fact, Iliador may have not even been there, but regardless, the fallout would be extreme. While Rasputin had been in the Holy Land, Iliador had written him asking for his help after his conspiracy-laden screeds against the Prime Minister had led to police involvement. But when a response didn't come fast enough for him, he took Rasputin's silence as a betrayal and turned on him. Soon, he and Hermogenes were central figures in a public campaign to banish Rasputin from court. Iliador in particular pushed the narrative that Rasputin controlled the royal family and was Alexandra's lover. But then, odd things started happening, particularly bad things for Rasputin's enemies. Theophan was exiled, Hermogenes banished to a remote monastery, and Iliador essentially arrested and imprisoned before renouncing his faith and going on the run. Now, there is no evidence that their conflict with Rasputin was the reason for these punishments. The fact is, all three of them were firebrands who'd clashed with both the church and the crown. I mean, heck, Iliador had even gotten a hold of Alexandra and her daughter's letters to Rasputin and initiated a blackmail attempt. But regardless of the facts, the popular narrative was, Rasputin was so powerful, he could have his rivals banished or killed. Yeah, that's right, killed. Months earlier, the prime minister, a Rasputin opponent, had been shot, and this too was chalked up in the public eye as another of Rasputin's victims. Then, a barrage of investigations came as the church began investigating Rasputin's beliefs, and the secret police once again began shadowing him in hopes of discovering he was secretly a Kleist. All of this, predictably, caused a furor in the press, who realized that news about Rasputin sold a lot of newspapers. The more salacious and extreme the claims, the better. Tsar Nicholas, rightly understanding that these scandals were undermining the monarchy, gave orders for government officials to meet with editors and discourage the stories. When that failed, he simply had copies of newspapers confiscated. Which is when things got real political. Because one of the biggest reforms after the 1905 revolution was a guaranteed freedom of speech. And in intervening, Nicholas had just forced a standoff between the crown and the Duma, the Russian National Assembly, also established in 1905. The Duma began debating whether they would open an official inquiry into Rasputin, the Tsar, and the press intervention. And when Nicholas summoned representatives to the palace to talk about it, and then they clashed, it led to a rift between the Duma and the crown. Basically, Nicholas was used to being an autocrat. His words. It wasn't taking well to the Duma investigating his private life. And actually, Nicholas didn't even seem to have liked Rasputin much. But on principle, he wasn't going to cave. Turns out, some Duma members were only too happy to pick that fight. See, a lot of Duma representatives had been involved in the revolution and wanted to go even farther. So for them, Rasputin was a convenient prop to criticize the monarchy indirectly. The worse Rasputin looked, the more the Romanovs were dragged through the mud. So they went hard at Rasputin, hoping that it would help the cause of revolution. Though, weirdly, monarchists were doing the same thing. They also realized that Rasputin was eroding public support for the Tsar, and thought that if they could smear him badly enough to drive him from court, it would protect the monarchy, which of course backfired, and by 1912 some conservatives were telling each other to stop, lest they bring on a revolution. But there was no putting this demon back in the bottle. In addition to secret police following Rasputin around, there were now reporters tracking his movements. He was the celebrity. It got creepy. Rasputin's eldest daughter received anonymous phone calls from a man trying to bait her into a meeting, claiming to love her. Turns out he was a reporter trying to get close to the family. And this was all getting to be too much. And Rasputin decided, apparently on his own, to go back to Pokrovska for a while. His enemies celebrated this as a victory. Ha! They'd done it! They'd driven him away from... Oh, no, wait, he's back. Yep, on vacation with the Romanovs. Sneaky, sneaky. Because the fact was, the underlying cause of Rasputin's presence hadn't changed. Alexei still, secretly, had hemophilia. Rasputin's presence comforted and calmed Alexandra and her son, which probably in itself helped his healing. In the summer of 1912, 8-year-old Alexei had another episode. A jolting carriage ride had started a hematoma in his thigh, which bled for days and caused him incredible agony. Their son's pain and fever were so bad, Nicholas couldn't even bear to be in the same room, and fled weeping. Alexandra was distraught. Alexei received last rites, and he asked his mother to reassure him that when he died, it wouldn't hurt anymore. Informed by Alexandra, Rasputin responded with a telegram. God has seen your tears and heard your prayers. The little one will not die. Do not allow the doctors to bother him too much. Alexei recovered 2 days later. Possibly because Rasputin's confidence lessened the stress on him and his mother. Possibly because doctors stopped prescribing aspirin that thinned his blood and constantly probing the hematoma. And possibly because he just recovered. And look, if you're a parent, you understand how crushing it would be to see your kid in such misery. And you could imagine how you'd fiercely defend anyone who could help in that situation. But the key factor to this is The public didn't understand that, because it didn't know that Alexei had hemophilia. So to them, Rasputin's continued presence was inexplicable at best, sinister at worst. What did he have on the Romanovs? Had he hypnotized them? Was he controlling them? Were they just weak? Don't they care the entire country hated this man and wanted him gone? He became even more controversial during the First Balkan War, when he lobbied the royal family to keep Russia out of the conflicts and pursue a policy of peace. War, he worried, would simply hurt the peasants and could even pull in the great powers and ruin Russia. Despite his supposed influence, it should be noted that Russia did join the First Balkan War, though not the Second. But his anti-war stance made him even more controversial. Government ministers, even family members, started their own private campaigns to get him expelled. The secret police continued their surveillance, initially giving Rasputin the codename Ruski, or the Russian, but later changing his designation to the Dark One. They chronicled his trips with female followers to bathhouses and visits to sex workers. Agents tailed anyone who had contact with him and read their mail. Though still, after all of this, when they presented Nicholas their report, he discarded it. But there were other plans to get rid of Rasputin. Violent plans. The police foiled at least one, and then it happened. June 1914, Pokrovska, Siberia. Rasputin has just stepped out his front door, hoping to catch a telegram messenger he'd just dispatched. That's when he sees the woman. She's disheveled, strange, wearing a bonnet and veil so only her eyes show. Though her veil is oddly flat, as if she lacks a nose. A common symptom for poor sex workers who have been ravaged by syphilis. Thinking she's seeking money, he greets her and takes out his wallet. Then she steps close and plunges an 18-inch dagger into his stomach. He clasps his hands at his belly, running down the street yelling for help. The strange woman pursues, holding the bloody knife high. In a moment of quick thinking, Rasputin notices a big stick, snatches it up, and clubs the woman across the head. An investigation will find that the woman is a 33-year-old peasant and mentally unstable. A devoted follower of Iliador, after reading his attacks on Rasputin, she'd taken it upon herself to kill the devil and stalked him across several cities. Rasputin's surgery was messy, very touch and go. Bad enough that newspapers in the capital, employing the usual exaggeration, actually reported his death. His enemies drank toasts and celebrated. Until a few days later, that is, when it came out that Rasputin had lived. A recovery owed to a good surgeon and strong constitution, but that appeared to the public like a supernatural resurrection. For it would take more than a stab wound to kill Rasputin. It would take a prince. Siberia, August 1914. Rasputin lies in his hospital bed, recovering from the assassination attempt while trying to stop a catastrophe. The Archduke Franz Ferdinand has been murdered. Tensions are rising, and government ministers are arguing over whether or not to mobilize. Day after day, Rasputin telegrams Emperor Nicholas in St. Petersburg, sending 20 messages in all, trying to influence him, begging him not to take the action he so fears. Do not go to war over the Balkans. He says it will only bring disaster, that it will be the ruin of Russia and bring danger to the imperial family. No good can come from it. He appeals to Alexandra, who behind closed doors has hour-long arguments with her husband over the question of war. Yet as he lies in his hospital bed, Rasputin gets the news. The First World War has begun. He won't live to see its end. When police questioned Rasputin's would-be assassin, they quickly began to suspect that she'd been put up to the act by Iliador, a suspicion that only hardened once an informer told them that Iliador had paid the woman and tried to acquire explosives for a series of terrorist attacks. They came for Iliador at his home, but he fled via a tunnel dressed as a woman. A month later, he was in Norway writing a book about Rasputin called The Holy Devil. Meanwhile, Rasputin began to spiral. Already hounded by press and police attention, there was now the added stress of both acting as a spiritual advisor to a royal couple at war and the fear of assassinations. He started to become more the man his enemies made him out to be. Now, Rasputin had always had mistresses, and it appears he did sleep with followers and sex workers. But as the war continued, this got more brazen. The secret police logged him visiting sex workers, sometimes twice a day, and he openly propositioned society women. Also, while he as a pilgrim gave up alcohol, Rasputin resumed its use upon coming to court, throwing massive parties and starting to appear drunk in public. At one point, he became so intoxicated on a train that people could look into the window of his private compartment as he vomited, passed out, and wet himself. And while the most infamous stories about his behavior during this period are fabrications, the real stuff was bad enough. He also gained unprecedented political influence, since Nicholas was frequently off visiting the front, leaving Alexandra with few close companions she trusted for guidance. In fact, Rasputin was in the imperial couple's lives non-stop. He wrote Nicholas with advice, telling him to throw his weight around as monarch, and even proposing policy. He suggested, for example, to delay the second military draft until after the harvest to minimize the impact on peasants. But Nicholas disregarded Rasputin's advice frequently. For instance, when he chose to take personal command over the army, a move that went against Rasputin's advice to stay close to home. But to be fair, everyone knew that was a bad idea. Nicholas was already seen as weak and incompetent, and this would tie his reputation to a conflict that was, in every way, not looking good for Russia. Rasputin was far more successful exerting power through Alexandra, a power that mostly consisted of getting allies appointed to government offices and his enemies removed from them. Sometimes for good reason, like mistreatment of religious minorities, but at other times simply because someone's presence in power made Rasputin feel unsafe. And when opponents did cross him, he increasingly threatened to take it up with the Tsar. But the thing was, Rasputin wasn't being paranoid. They really were out to get him. More press campaigns hit him in 1915, but this time with a new and dangerous element: the claims that he was a German spy, pushing Nicholas toward peace with the Central Powers. A particularly toxic accusation, given how he was now so associated with Alexandra, whose already low popularity had dropped even further due to her German heritage. One Duma member, Vladimir Purushkevich, went so far as to give a speech calling the royal couple marionettes of the evil genius Rasputin, and saying that Alexandra had remained a German on the Russian throne, alien to the country and its people. The speech was purposely incendiary. A year before, demonstrators had called to have Alexandra banished to a convent, and mobs had killed ethnic Germans in Moscow. Purushkevich was playing with fire, but a fire that drew others. Because after this speech, Purushkevich found himself approached by Prince Felix Yusupov, one of the richest men in Russia, who invited Purushkevich into a plot to kill Rasputin, along with himself, an army officer from an elite guards unit, and Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, the Tsar's cousin. December 29, 1916, Yusupov Palace. A cold night in St. Petersburg, a good night for a housewarming. And that's what Rasputin has been told this is. A celebration of the palace's renovations nearing completion. Prince Yusupov, a man who has come to him for healing, getting close to him for years, ushers him into a basement room with a gramophone playing Yankee Doodle over and over. Before dawn, Rasputin will be shot 3 times. That's the only thing we know for sure, because the only accounts of that night come from people who have every reason to lie, to shift and spread blame, to make Rasputin out to be a monster whose killing was justified by his demonic refusal to let death take him. Prince Yusupov's account, the most famous, claims that he served Rasputin cyanide-laced cakes and tea. Yusupov says that he sat there in awe as Rasputin gobbled them down with no ill effects. Next, he says, he plied him with poisoned wine, which again did nothing. A man prone to believing in the supernatural, Yusupov began to panic. He says he went upstairs, got a revolver from other conspirators, and then returned, telling Rasputin to look at the crucifix before shooting him once through the chest. Stashing the body in the basement, the group dressed an army officer in Rasputin's coat and drove the man to Rasputin's apartment so witnesses would see him going home. Then they went to move the body. But when Yusupov lifted the corpse, it came alive. Rasputin, wounded, clawed at his would-be killer, then scrambled to his feet and fled into the snow of the courtyard, the assassins following. And that is where Grand Duke Dmitry put him down with 2 shots, one point blank through the forehead. Then, with it perilously close to dawn, they dropped him off a bridge into a river through a hole in the ice. Now, it should be noted that historians don't generally believe Yusupov's account. It doesn't match up to the memories of other conspirators, and Yusupov himself had a lifelong fascination with theatricality, melodrama, and play acting. And there are plenty of other theories. But one thing most everyone can agree on: these guys were in no way professional killers. They'd never murdered anyone before, and because the post-mortem examination found no trace of poison, it's been suggested that Yusupov's supplier hadn't even given him real cyanide. Instead, the whole thing, from start to finish, seems like a drunken botch job by aristocratic flunkies. Alexandra insisted the plotters be shot, but Nicholas quietly transferred them to the front or confined them to their estates instead. And when word spread that the police had pulled Rasputin's body out from under the ice, people came to the river where they found him and scooped buckets of water as if it were sanctified. It was an expression of the old Russia, one that did not have long to live. For 2 months later, when winter food prices led to looting and police opened fire, riots broke out. The February Revolution had begun, and by March, Nicholas had abdicated and was living under house arrest with the provisional government in charge. In October, the Bolsheviks seized control. Of course, this would have likely happened without Rasputin. After all, with 1.7 million Russians dead in the war, hunger throughout the country, and an aristocracy refusing to modernize, there were more than enough historical forces to drive change. But there's no doubt that Rasputin played a role, providing a concrete figure the opposition could rally against. And once he was removed, the criticisms he'd absorbed for years instead fell personally on Nicholas. In looking back, it's hard not to think of Rasputin as a figure of our modern age. One who, whatever the truth, had his public image defined through partisan press, conspiracy theories, and the distortion of fame. One whose memory could be defined by men like Ilyador and Yusupov, who had both literally tried to kill him and then wrote books about him, casting him as a wicked advisor or fairy tale sorcerer who brought down a monarch. Ultimately, Rasputin serves as a warning against being seduced by a good story, one that's too cut and dry to be true, because history isn't like that. It's messy, full of contradictions, often told by people who are unreliable, deeply biased, or that don't know the whole story.
And if those stories work hard enough, they can create a man who never really existed. Which, did you know, was actually something we explored even before this series originally aired. Yeah, thanks to our patrons, and, real talk being very stir-crazy during the pandemic, we produced a Rasputin 2020 April Fool's video exploring the history of the Mad Monk via Boney M lyrics, and we're gonna show it to you, but before we cap the series off with that, I wanted to mention that the only reason we're able to make our animated videos in the first place is due to the amazing support of our patrons over on Patreon. Becoming a patron at any level is truly the most direct way to support us in telling the historical tales that you love. But we also want to make sure that that support is fun and interactive, which is why we set up our perks to encourage that on a lot of different levels. For example, suggesting and voting on extra history topics, chatting with us on our friendly official Discord, discounted merch at our merch store, which we just added a bunch of neat stuff to, viewing all of our shows early, snagging some exclusive 4K wallpapers, and even getting your name in the credits, which I'm sure you've seen or heard at this point. You can check all that out by clicking the link in the description or scanning the QR code right over there. But if you are already a patron, thank you again. I know it sounds trite and we say it all the time, but your monthly support is truly our most reliable source of income for everyone at this small studio, and it's what allows us to continue to tell important historical tales, even when they get a little funky, like what you are about to watch right now. Enjoy.
There lived a certain man in Russia long ago. He was big and strong, in his eyes a flaming glow. Most people looked at him with terror and with fear. But to Moscow chicks, he was such a lovely dear. He could preach the Bible like a preacher, full of ecstasy and fire. But he was also the kind of teacher women would desire. Rah rah Rasputin, lover of the Russian queen, there was a cat that really was gone. Rah rah Rasputin, Russia's greatest love machine, it was a shame how he carried on. He ruled the Russian land, and never mind the Tsar, but the Cossack chalk he danced was really wunderbar. In all affairs of state, he was the man to please, but he was really great when he had a girl to... For the queen, he was no wheeler dealer, though she'd heard the things he'd done. She believed he was a holy healer who would heal her son. Rah rah Rasputin, lover of the Russian queen. There was a cat that really was gone. Rah rah Rasputin, Russia's greatest love machine? It was a shame how he carried on. But when his drinking and lusting and his hunger for power became known to more and more people, the demand to do something about this outrageous man became louder and louder. Hey, 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 hey. This man's just got to go, declared his enemies. But the ladies begged, don't you try to do it, please. No doubt this Rasputin had lots of hidden charms. Though he was a brute, they just fell into his arms. Then one night, some men of higher standing set a trap. They're not to blame. Come to visit us, they kept demanding. And he really came. Rasputin, lover of the Russian queen. They put some poison into his wine. Rasputin, Russia's greatest love machine. He drank it all and then said, I feel fine. Rasputin, lover of the Russian queen. They didn't quit. They wanted his head. Rasputin, Russia's greatest love machine. And so they shot him until he was dead. All right, Rob, I think I got it all. What? Oh, did I miss something? Oh, wait, I know. Rasputin, the way it's said rhymes with poutine. I wonder why it was pronounced odd. Yum, 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 poutine, Canada's gift to cuisine. Cheese curds and fries with gravy poured on. Wow, 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 wow. Wait for the drop. Rasputin. Brand new song. I don't know what I'm doing right now, but I'm playing the air guitar for Papa Rasputin, and the credits won't ever stop going on, so I will just keep on singing to Rasputin. That didn't. What am I doing with my life? Once again, to help ensure the future of Extra History by supporting us on Patreon, click right here. And then once you do, you'll be joining the awesome ranks of Angela Valenciana, Arles Posting, Dominic Valenciana, Hunter Z, Joseph Blame, Kuya Koi, Lotus Wolf, and Ziliad's Architectures are absolutely phenomenal legendary patrons.